The most formidable enemy faced by U.S. pilots in the Pacific was not the Japanese Zero or the anti-aircraft gun. It was the sheer, terrifying scale of the ocean itself. The distances between American forward bases and the vital Japanese targets islands like Iwo Jima, Rabaul, or the Philippines were enormous, often stretching beyond the effective range of the aircraft designed to fight the war. A successful mission meant a round trip of many thousands of miles, much of it flown over featureless blue water, where one small mistake in navigation or engine management meant certain death. Unlike the European theater, where a forced landing might mean capture, a forced landing in the Pacific meant ditching into freezing water, far from rescue, where survival was a near impossibility. This reality created a crushing psychological burden. Every pilot took off knowing that their fuel tanks were literally a clock counting down to their survival. They had to fly with absolute precision, battling not only the enemy, but the relentless physics of distance, and the certainty that if their calculations were off by even a few gallons, their fate was sealed. The mission planning wasn't about finding the enemy. It was about the desperate calculus of fuel remaining versus miles flown, with the vast, empty Pacific always waiting below to claim them. For the pilots strapped into the cockpits of legendary fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the heavy B-29 Superfortress, their most immediate and constant source of anxiety was the red line on the fuel gauge. The enemy was tangible, but the lack of fuel was an invisible, implacable killer. Hours into a mission, the needle dropping closer to empty became an obsession, overriding the immediate threat of combat. Many pilots described checking the fuel indicator not just with concern, but with a visceral dread, knowing that its relentless downward creep dictated whether they would see the end of the day, mission, or simply vanish into the sea. This meant that often their primary operational enemy wasn't the Japanese pilot they were trying to shoot down, but the terrifyingly short duration of their own fuel supply. This wasn't just individual anxiety, it was a strategic failure. The powerful, thirsty American engines dictated the operational range, forcing pilots to turn back from targets that were clearly visible on the horizon. Pilots were ordered to jettison external fuel tanks the moment combat began, ensuring they had enough maneuverability to fight, but also committing them to a one-way trip if they couldn't drastically conserve fuel on the return leg. The fuel gauge was a constant reminder that their fighting time was limited, their survival margin was razor-thin, and that the problem lay deep within the design philosophy of the American aircraft engine. Engines like the mighty Rolls-Royce Merlin used in the P-51 and the complex Wright R-3350 Cyclone used in the B-29 were engineering marvels, but they were optimized almost exclusively for raw power and high speed, the attributes needed to win a dogfight or deliver a payload rapidly. To achieve this maximum performance, the engines were designed to burn a rich fuel mixture, meaning they injected an excessive amount of fuel relative to the air entering the cylinder. This richness achieved two critical functions for high performance. It ensured maximum power output and, crucially, the excess fuel acted as an internal coolant, protecting the engine's valves and pistons from the extreme heat generated during full throttle operation. However, this method came at a crippling cost: terrible fuel economy. When flying long distances, this rich setting meant thousands of gallons of expensive aviation gas were simply being consumed far too quickly, often limiting the true effective combat radius to a fraction of the theoretical range. The very power that made the planes dominant in combat was actively limiting their ability to reach the fight. That beautiful, powerful engine in front of them was an absolute glutton. This fundamental engineering trade-off, power for economy, created an immediate and unbreakable strategic wall in the vast Pacific theater. Mission planners were forced to shorten or outright scrub vital bombing and escort missions because the aircraft simply could not carry enough fuel to reach targets deep within the Japanese defense perimeter and return safely. Targets deemed essential for victory, such as key Japanese airfields, naval bases, or industrial centers often lay agonizingly just outside the viable combat radius of the Allied bombers and fighters, frustrating commanders at every level. The inability to cover the vast distances meant that the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces had to expend tremendous resources on island hopping, slowly and bloodily moving their bases forward, mile by mile. This limitation cost time, men, and resources, unnecessarily lengthening the war. The entire strategic objective was being limited not by Japanese defenses, but by the relentless physics of internal combustion. The only way to win the war faster was to somehow stretch the fuel supply. But according to every existing manual, aggressively reducing fuel flow meant inviting a catastrophic engine-melting failure. Standard aeronautical engineering doctrine established a rigid definition for the perfect fuel mixture, prioritizing safety and power above all else. For maximum horsepower needed during takeoffs, climbs, and combat maneuvers, pilots were instructed to use a rich fuel mixture, meaning the engine was deliberately fed more gasoline than was chemically necessary for complete combustion. This richness was essential because the excess unburned fuel served a vital secondary function. It acted as an internal coolant, carrying heat away from the critical engine components like the cylinder heads and exhaust valves. This prevented the highly powerful engines from reaching temperatures that would cause catastrophic pre-ignition, detonation, or outright mechanical failure, which were constant threats at full throttle. This safety-first approach, however, ensured inefficiency. The resulting combustion was incomplete, meaning a significant amount of the precious high-octane aviation fuel was essentially wasted, pouring unburnt out of the exhaust stack as heat and dark smoke. The engineers had designed a highly efficient machine for short bursts of absolute power, but for the grueling long-haul flights across the immense Pacific distances, this rich mixture setting transformed the engine from a marvel of engineering into a relentless, thirsty liability. The trade-off was safety and power versus range, and until necessity intervened, the manual always mandated safety. The inverse of the rich setting was the lean mixture, where the pilot manually restricted the flow of fuel, bringing the ratio closer to the chemical ideal for complete combustion. While this promised excellent fuel economy, pilots were explicitly forbidden from running their engines too aggressively lean for any sustained period of time. This was not merely a guideline. It was an unspoken rule, backed by terrifying cockpit experience. When an engine ran extremely lean, the excess fuel coolant was removed from the system. Combustion temperatures inside the cylinders immediately spiked, climbing rapidly and dangerously close to the point where the engine's internal metals would simply melt, seize, or suffer fatal damage. Any pilot who dared to flirt with this boundary, attempting to squeeze a few extra miles out of a tank, risked a catastrophic engine failure hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly territory. The engine would run roughly, temperatures would soar past the red line on the gauge, and the risk of pre-ignition, where fuel ignites prematurely and destroys the piston, became almost certain. For commanders and engineering officers, the possibility of a plane being lost due to a desperate, unauthorized attempt at fuel conservation was unacceptable, making the risk of a lean-run engine far more feared than any Japanese fighter. Faced with the unbreakable strategic wall imposed by persistent engine thirst, a few determined pilots and dedicated ground crew members began to push back against the rigid doctrines laid down in the flight manuals. These were often unauthorized and conducted in secret, using long, uneventful ferry flights or routine patrols over safe waters as private test beds. These pioneers reasoned that if the difference between mission success and complete failure was just a few hundred miles of range, the risk of a slow engine failure was worth the potential payoff. The focus shifted from maximizing power to maximizing thermal efficiency, hoping to unlock the full potential energy stored in every gallon of fuel. The experiments were agonizingly slow and painstaking. Pilots would make minute adjustments to the mixture control, constantly watching the cylinder head temperature gauge, the most critical indicator of impending disaster, while nervously listening to the rhythm of the engine. They were searching for a narrow, technical sweet spot where the engine was still safe enough to operate, but was burning fuel far more efficiently than the manual allowed. Every successful hour flown under these dangerous non-standard settings was a small, quiet victory against the limitations that were strangling the entire offensive campaign. Out of these desperate trials, a radical and counterintuitive secret tactic began to spread through the pilot communities, passed along in whispered instructions at maintenance hangars and mess halls. The technique required the pilot to deliberately lean the mixture control far past the point recommended by the flight manual, a setting that would cause the powerful engine to sound profoundly distressed. The process involved leaning the mixture until the engine began to sputter, falter, and run audibly rough, making it sound, to the uninitiated, exactly as if the pilot were intentionally trying to kill the engine through fuel starvation. This roughness was the critical auditory feedback. It signaled that the engine had crossed the efficiency threshold and was beginning to run dangerously hot and unstable. The trick was then to immediately and precisely advance the mixture control just enough to restore a smooth, steady power output, but no further. By constantly flying the aircraft on this absolute ragged edge, where the engine was on the brink of roughness and failure, pilots were forcing the fuel-air ratio into the state of maximum thermal efficiency, squeezing the absolute last drop of potential energy out of the gas without crossing the line into self-destruction. This dangerous tightrope walk became the unofficial, life-saving secret of the long-range pilot. The technological breakthrough achieved by these desperate field experiments lay in finding the engine's hidden sweet spot, the extremely narrow band where the fuel-air mixture was chemically perfect for combustion, yielding maximum energy release without triggering engine destruction. By flying precisely on the ragged edge of roughness, pilots were achieving what engineers previously deemed impossible: operating the powerful Allison and Merlin engines at their peak thermal efficiency. This meant that virtually every molecule of gasoline was being used to generate forward thrust, rather than being wasted as excess cooling agent or unburned exhaust. The engine was no longer a gas-guzzling beast. It was a highly efficient furnace, but one that demanded constant, nervous attention from the pilot to keep it from crossing the invisible line into catastrophe. This technique required the pilot to shed reliance on the gauges alone. They had to fly not by sight, but by sound constantly, listening to the rhythm and harmony of the complex engine. The moment the sound became anything less than smooth, indicating roughness or instability, the pilot had to instantly make minute adjustments, nursing the mixture back from the brink of failure. It was an intense, high-stakes relationship between man and machine, transforming the act of long-distance flight from a rigid procedure into a delicate, continuous performance. This mastery was the key to unlocking the true, unforeseen range potential of the American air fleet. The results of this counterintuitive sputtering technique were staggering and immediate. Using the engine on this fine, dangerous edge of efficiency, pilots were able to consistently extend their operational range not by a small percentage, but by a shocking margin, sometimes by up to 100%. Fighter aircraft that had previously been limited to missions 500 miles out could suddenly execute successful 1,000-mile round trips. This meant the planes could fly to targets previously considered entirely unreachable, stay longer on station to escort heavy bombers, and still return safely to base with an acceptable fuel reserve. The physics of the war had suddenly and dramatically shifted in the Allies' favor. The immediate operational consequences were profound, especially for the long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang and the P-38 Lightning. These fighters could now reach deep into enemy airspace, protecting vital bomber streams from start to finish. Bomber crews, who previously faced the terrifying prospect of hours of unescorted flight over enemy territory, now enjoyed continuous protection. This breakthrough instantly neutralized a key element of the Japanese and German air defense strategies, which relied heavily on hitting the vulnerable, unescorted bombers far from the combat zone. The success of the new maximum range mixture technique rested entirely on the skill and iron discipline of the pilot. It required continuous active management of the engine mixture controls for hours on end, turning the act of flying into a grueling test of focus. The pilot had to actively suppress every natural instinct learned in flight school, instincts that screamed at them to richen the mixture whenever the engine sounded rough or temperatures spiked. It was a constant mental battle to keep the engine operating on the ragged high-temperature edge between maximum efficiency and fatal mechanical breakdown. Any moment of lapse in concentration, a slight movement of the wrong lever, a moment of fatigue, or a failure to hear the subtle changes in the engine's rhythm could lead to immediate detonation, seizure, and the rapid, fiery loss of the aircraft and crew. This technique transformed the pilot from a mere operator into a highly specialized engine manager, flying almost entirely by the sound waves transmitted through the airframe and demanding a level of precision that few jobs in the world could match. Their confidence in their ears and their hands had to outweigh the overwhelming threat indicated by the screaming temperature gauges. What began as a dangerous, unauthorized secret whispered among desperate pilots quickly became impossible for the military high command to ignore. The irrefutable evidence, the sheer increase in successful long-range missions, the rise in combat air patrol time, and the direct testimony from surviving crews forced the engineering command to reverse decades of safety-first doctrine. The maximum range mixture, the practice of deliberately running the engine on the borderline of roughness, was swiftly codified and integrated into official flight manuals across the entire air fleet. This represented a significant cultural and technical shift, acknowledging that field ingenuity had successfully bypassed flawed factory assumptions. New training protocols were established specifically to teach pilots the art of flying by ear, trusting their auditory input over potentially lagging temperature gauges. The manuals now explicitly instructed pilots to ignore the engine's protests and push the mixture until the engine began to protest, a direct and stunning inversion of pre-war flying instruction. This codified risk became a fundamental new element of Allied air strategy. The simple, counterintuitive technique of deliberately running the engine on the brink of failure delivered one of the most significant strategic victories of the air war. This small technical adjustment allowed bombers and fighters to successfully reach key Japanese bases, such as those in the Philippines and mainland targets that had previously been entirely untouchable. The operational range of the air fleet was effectively doubled, meaning the vast distances of the Pacific theater, which had so long dictated the pace of the war, strategically shrank by half. This breakthrough directly enabled the success of major strategic offensives, dramatically shortening the path to Japan. The engineers and pilots had found a way to conquer the tyranny of distance, proving that sometimes the most complex military problems can be solved by embracing the very risk that conventional wisdom forbids. The choice to deliberately kill the engine rather than treating it gently became the life-saving, war-winning tactic that ensured Allied air dominance and allowed the final, decisive push toward victory.